School Leader. It's a new week. Let's look and see what's coming up. Remember, we're in the unit entitled Made for Something More. We're in week 3. It's entitled I Am a Minister out of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 12. And the point of the lesson is that God works through us to make a difference. Now, I'm not one really to stir up dissension in a class. I think this will work and actually be funny in my class. It may or may not be for you. You might tell your students as you're opening your Bible that this week's lesson is out of 2 Corinthians. Of course, we know that's a reference back to Donald Trump's statement he made a year or so ago. Anyway, like I said, that may or may not work for you. If you've ever heard anybody say that LifeWay's Bible Study for Life lessons aren't deep enough, I want you to point them to this week's lesson. To me, the text is very difficult reading, and to me, it's a difficult lesson. So here's how I'm going to handle the lesson. I'm going to start in verse 1 and read the whole thing, verses 1 through 12. And then, anyway, by starting back in verse 1 and reading those first 3 verses, it kind of gives a better feel for what's said in verse 4 and following. After I read that entire passage at once, then we're going to list out some differences between the Old and New Covenant. And most of these are mentioned or at least implied in the text. So as we look at these, we see that we have the ministry of death in the Old Covenant contrasted with life. Tablets of stone versus tablets on hearts. The external versus internal. The letter versus the spirit. We work under the Old Covenant, but God equips under the New Covenant. It's a faded glory, not the genes. It's a faded glory under the Old Testament and a surpassing glory in the New Covenant. The Old Covenant condemns, but the New Covenant is glorious. The Old Covenant fades away, but the New Covenant lasts. So after we spend some time comparing and contrasting the Old and New Covenant, they're all mentioned there in these 12 verses, then we're going to go back and look at verse 6 specifically and emphasize that it's God who enables. It says there that He made us competent as ministers of the New Covenant. He's the one that made us competent. Now, sure, there's an element of us in there. Hopefully, even as a Sunday school teacher, you just don't show up unprepared and just let the Spirit lead. Hopefully, you're doing a little preparation, but God's the one that enables you to have that gift of teaching. We need to note here that that word ministers comes from that word diakonos, and that's the Greek word where we get the word deacon. So it's a servant, a deacon, minister. That's who we are called to be. So yes, we are all servants. We are all ministers. However, I'm going to say this with some hesitation here. I don't know that I can teach this lesson in good conscience as it's intended, because yes, I believe that all Christians are called to minister, but I believe that there are some other passages that would prove this point better. Specifically the 4 spiritual gift passages, which we find in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, and 1 Peter 4. And you say, well, why is that, Jim? Why don't you like this text? Well, the way I read 2 Corinthians is this. Paul's talking about himself and others who ministered there in Corinth when he says we. I don't think he's referring to all Christians, even though it's true that all Christians are ministers, all Christians are servants. We go back to chapter 3, verse 2, and it says, you yourselves are our letter. Okay, so there's the distinction between you and we or us, our. Okay, there's that distinction there. And then it goes on down and talks about we. And so I'm thinking that the we he's talking about is not all Christians in general. I think he's talking about, when he says you, you're talking about you all, the Corinthians. He's talking about I, he's talking about Paul. Of course, when he's talking about we or us, he's talking about Paul, Timothy, and others who ministered there in Corinth. So while I believe that the point of the lesson is true, that God works through us to make a difference, and He equips us, as those spiritual gift passages indicate, I really don't think it's a good passage to use to scripturally back up that point. But that's me. I could be wrong. And I am quite often. So anyway, that's my opinion on that. That may or may not be right. I just want to tell you that up front. So do with that what you want to. Look at your lesson material. It's got some good in-depth study in there about some of the words and some of the passages there, and it explains that a lot better than I could. So I am going to teach this lesson, but I think at the end I am going to kind of mention what I've mentioned here and actually go into the spiritual gifts passages and look at those a little bit. So anyway, that's all I've got for this week. I hope you have a great week.